Greetings, everyone. Today, I would like to talk about our apostle Peter. And you remember the story between Peter and Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 16. When he asked about whom do you say I am, in 16 verse 16, Peter said, "You are the Son of living God." And Jesus said, "Son of Barjona, flesh and blood has not revealed these things to you, but my Father who is in heaven." And few verses down the line, 16 verse 21, when Jesus said, "The Son of Man must go to Jerusalem and be handed over to the chief priest, scribes, and being crucified, buried. On the third day, he would be risen." And Peter said, "This shall not happen to you," because suffering is something that was very, very foreign to him. And when you look at the first Peter and the second Peter in these books, and I can't imagine that is this the same Peter who said no to the suffering of Christ, who wrote more about the sufferings? Unbelievable. How did he change in his mind about the suffering? He said no to the sufferings of the Lord in 16 verse 21. But here in the first Peter, and he has totally rewired in his thinking about suffering. And he says in First Peter chapter 1, verse 6, and suffering is good because it is going to purify your faith. Just think about it. And then he goes on to say in First Peter chapter 3, 21 to 25, he says, Christ is our example for our suffering. It is not the believer who is sitting next to me. Christ is our example. And then he quotes the submissive nature of Christ in the midst of suffering, that he did not revile against suffering. And he gave himself to the Father. And then he quotes the sacrificial nature of Christ's suffering, that he was not suffering for his own sins, but he was suffering for others. And he says, Christ is our example. And then he goes on to say that this suffering is interesting in First Peter chapter 4, verse 1. And this suffering we go through because we don't want to fulfill the desires of our flesh. Wow. The flesh wants something. The flesh says that I want you to do this. Romans 8, verse 12. The flesh speaks to me saying that you are indebted to me. You got to do this so that you will get the pleasure. But when I say no to my flesh, and there is a suffering. Jesus said, if your right hand sins, cut it off. And it is quite a suffering to have that hand cut off. Just think about it. And he says that our suffering is because we say no to the flesh. And then he goes on to say that in 4 verse 12, don't you even be surprised when you go through suffering. Don't you see suffering to be the strange thing in your life? Is this the man who said no to suffering of the Lord Jesus Christ in Matthew 16:21? What did it happen to him that his mind is totally rewired and he has a different thought about suffering? Unbelievable. He says, in the midst of suffering, your faith will be purified and it is going to be more valuable than gold. Just think about it. Gold is the one that really affects a currency, of a country. It affects the international trade between countries. And gold has the strong impact on the credit worthiness of a country. If the country's economy is going to be measured by the gold, and Peter says, when you go through the suffering and when your faith gets purified, and it is more valuable than that. Unbelievable. I really was blown away by the thoughts that Peter had about suffering, and he wrote a beautiful book, First Peter. And this is our devotion. Thank you so much. Have a blessed day.